Good evening. It is not often I put the scripture reading in the middle of a song, but my bad. Thank you for doing that for us, Mark. And we will be heading to 1 Samuel tonight. 1 Samuel chapter 4 is where we're starting this evening as we consider a basic question. I'm going to survey a few different chapters of Samuel. I've been reading it this past week, and the things there have really stuck out to me. Because as I think about discipleship, as we're going through this year and through this theme, as I think about discipleship, those synonyms come readily to mind. A disciple is a follower. A disciple is a student. A disciple is a learner. And all of these things imply that you're following something, or you're a learner of some subject. You're listening to someone else. And so that question is, what are we supposed to follow? And we know that answer, right? That's a basic answer. We're supposed to follow Jesus. We just sang a song about that, a really good song with that repeated chorus of pledging yourself to Jesus. That's obviously the right answer, right? We're the church of Christ. That better be the right answer. And yet, it gets really difficult because every human has a choice in what they follow. And isn't human choice really where things get messy? Everything would be so good if humans just did what they were supposed to do. But instead, God gave us free will to allow us to willingly serve Him, but that also allows us to disobey Him. And we get dragged aside and we start following other things. And we follow other things based on a variety of influences. Many humans base their life decisions on internal influences, don't we? The stuff that we feel and the stuff that we think and the stuff that comes from our own heads. And God gave us a conscience, and that's a good thing. That can be a good guiding light to where we should go. And yet, if that's the only thing we're following, that internal influence, maybe we're missing a little bit of the objective truth of the universe. And yet, some people only follow those external influences. What did my parents tell me to do? I'm going to keep on doing that. What did my teachers teach? That's the only way I'm going to be able to think. What did the outside push on me that now I just replicate in my own life? Usually we talk about these things internal, external. We call them nature and nurture, don't we? What comes from inside us? What comes from outside of us? Both of these things combine and push us to serve something. What is it? Is it going to be God or is it going to be something else? We have an entire book full of stories of when people chose to not follow God. And tonight, that's where I want to look to take a few different ideas from the pages of some old wisdom from 1 Samuel, starting in chapter 4. Everyone has a choice on what we follow. What we see here is several examples of the Israelites choosing precisely the wrong things, such as a proclivity for engaging in their own rituals. We might call this tradition, ritual, whatever you want to call it, just the stuff that they're familiar with because they're familiar with it. And you see them fall into the same old habits over and over and over again because it's what they've done and it's where they've been and it's what they're used to. And you see that again when you get to 1 Samuel chapter 4. Now, the beginning of Samuel has established Samuel as a character. Eli was the last judge. He wasn't very good. He was kind of negligent, not a great father, and probably not a great religious influence, honestly, although I guess that can be debated. His sons aren't any good, and God knows it's time for Samuel to take over. And so he plans to remove Eli's house, and he plans to install Samuel as the religious leadership, and he does so by means of a war that starts in 1 Samuel 4 in verse 1. So the word of Samuel came to all Israel. Now Israel went out to meet the Philistines in battle, and they camped beside Ebenezer, while the Philistines camped in Aphek. And the Philistines drew up in battle formation to meet Israel. Now when the battle spread, Israel was defeated by the Philistines, who killed about 4,000 men on the battlefield. And when the people came into the camp, the elders of Israel said, "Why has the Lord defeated us, Philistines?" And that's a really good question, because think about Israel's history up until this point, right? Their history has been a series of wars and conflicts that has been decided not by strength of arms and not by their military versus someone else's, but by the Lord and who he chose to support. You think back to Egypt, it was a couple hundred years ago, right? Maybe not quite that long. It was something around then. It's been a while, but it wasn't Israel might that got them out of slavery in Egypt. It was God. God picked them, and so they won. It was God who picked them to conquer the land of Canaan. That's the only reason they won Jericho. That's the only reason they won those fights. And every time they didn't rely on God, they didn't win. When you get to the book of Judges, you have story after story of the Israelites not relying on God, and so God picks for this other nation to win. And then God picks for the judge to win, and every time it's God's choice as to who won the battle. And so they ask a really good question. Why has the Lord defeated us? It's not about the Philistines defeating us, it's about the Lord. He has made the decision, and he has defeated us. What's their solution? 1 Samuel 4, the second half of verse 3. Let's take the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord from Shiloh, where the tabernacle was, so that he may come among us and save us from the power of our enemies. And so the people sent men to Shiloh, and from there they carried the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord of armies, who is enthroned above the cherubim, and the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were there with the Ark of the Covenant of God. What's wrong with that picture? Israel uses the Ark. They don't use the Ark because God told them to. They use the Ark because that's what they're used to. If you think about the Ark of the Covenant, look how it's described even in verse 4. It's the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord of armies, who is enthroned above the cherubim. On the lid of the Ark just means a box. It's a fancy word that just means box. And it has a lid. On it are two angels, the cherubim, that come together to form what is called the mercy seat, because this is considered God's throne. It's where God lives. And so Israel has a brilliant plan. Instead of asking God for help, instead of going to the Lord and asking if he will be on their side, let's drag his throne out and put it in danger, because if God's throne is in danger, he can't help but save us. That's where God's power is, right? That's where God lives, after all. He lives in the tabernacle in the Holy of Holies. He lives in the Ark of the Covenant. Maybe if we take the little gadget he's given and we put it out in front of us, he'll win the battle for us. You know, it's always won before. How did we cross the Jordan River? We sent the Ark first, and then the water dried up. How did we win Jericho? We made the Ark walk around the walls 7 times, a bunch of times in a row, and then they fell over. Maybe if we send the Ark ahead of us this time, maybe it's going to win for us again. What's the problem in that thinking? Aptly put by someone at Vacaville when I taught this earlier today. They think there's God in a box. And they can take the box wherever they want to, and they can open the box up, and there's God, and he's helping them, and then they can put the lid back on the box, and he's gone again. What are they doing? They're taking what they're used to, taking what they're familiar with, the Ark of the Covenant. It's won before, it's going to win again. And instead of going to God, they go to what's worked in the past. And instead of trying to appeal to the Lord, they stick on their own tradition, and it's what they're used to, and it's what they've done before, and so it's obviously going to work again. What's the result of the Ark of the Covenant? Look down at verse 10. 1 Samuel 4 and verse 10, the Philistines are freaking out, quite frankly, in verses 5 through 9. The Lord is coming. He's there. He's powerful. He beat Egypt. We have to fight him now. And so the Philistines fought. And Israel is defeated again. And every man fled to his tent, and the defeat was very great, for 30,000 foot soldiers of Israel fell. And moreover, the ark of God was taken. Israel went without divine backup the first time, lost 4,000 men. That was pretty bad. But then they go, relying on their tradition, relying on their ability to push all the right buttons and manipulate God into helping them, and they lose 30,000 people. And they lose the ark. And now they're not able to rely on that tradition anymore. Why do you think God allowed that? Maybe because he doesn't like it. God is willing to disgrace himself and let people look down upon him. He's willing to be defeated by a heathen nation, more willing to do that than encourage humans to engage in their traditionalism. And so we have to ask that question. How easy is it for us to do exactly the same things? To engage in the traditions of man instead of in true worship of God. Ask the Pharisees, right? They're the classic example. They're the punching bag of the whole situation because that's what they do. They teach as doctrine the commandments of men. The traditions that they hold to, they call it scripture and they teach it like it's God talking. Talk to Israel, who has made an idol out of God's ark, who is so familiar with the symbology that they think that they can use the same old symbols and win all of their victories. Think of all the Christians or nominal Christians who go to church, who have gone to church today because it's Sunday. And who have sang today, why? Because it's what they do. And who took the Lord's Supper because that's the usual thing that we all engage in. And who have prayed today, but only when the public prayers are being led. People who engage with God just because it's what they do. God's not looking for that. People who engage like that, God takes that ability away. No more ark. No more ark for you. You guys get banned from that. And now that the ark is gone, they realize they have to start following God. It's not about traditions. It's not about following the trappings of religion. It's not about following the form and hoping everything else comes later. It's about following God. And the form comes after that. If you follow God, you will worship him in the way he's commanded. If you only worship in the way he's commanded, you are not necessarily following God. God doesn't like people who engage in tradition rather than worship. And so he takes the ark away, and Israel is left with nothing. So what do they turn to? What does everyone always turn to in these situations? Okay, you can't rely on what you've always relied on. Why don't we bring out the false gods? So-called gods, beings that we can invoke when we need them and then put them away when we don't. Rather like tradition, isn't it? But now it's focused on one being. It's focused on one deity, one identity. Maybe it's God, maybe it's not. And again, in this idea, we might combine multiple ideas. These are people who make and worship idols, right? False gods, that's what we usually think of. But it's also people who make idols in a figurative sense. You don't have to have a statue of wood or stone in front of you to be an idolater. And it also includes people who worship their version of God, which is a bootleg version of the real God of the Bible. A God who maybe you emphasize the love and you forget the judgment part of it. Maybe you emphasize his mercy and grace and forget that he has wrath as well. So many people make idealized versions of God to govern themselves instead of listening to whom God is. And you see that problem crop up, especially in chapter 5, but a little bit in chapter 7 as well. Start looking at chapter 5. The Philistines take the ark of God and brought it from Ebenezer to Ashdod, right? From the land of Israel, from a place of help, they bring it to Ashdod, one of the cities of Philistia. And then the Philistines took the ark of God and they brought it into the house of Dagon. And they placed it beside Dagon. Dagon is one of the primary, maybe the primary Philistine god. I'm not really up to date on their theology, so I could be wrong on that. He's important to them. He has a temple, and they put God's covenant, God's ark, right before it because they know that it's the symbol of God. They trust that it is the symbol of Jehovah God who rescued Israel from Egypt, and yet he lost. And so they put it in front of their God, Dagon. They put the ark of God at Dagon's feet because Dagon reigns supreme. Until verse 3. And the Ashdodites got up early the next day, and behold, Dagon had fallen on his face to the ground before the ark of the Lord. Curious. And so, what do? They take Dagon and set him back up in his place. And when they got up early the next morning, behold, Dagon had fallen on his face to the ground before the ark of the Lord. And the head of Dagon and both palms of his hands were cut off from the threshold. Only the torso of Dagon was left. For that reason, neither the priest of Dagon nor any who enter Dagon's house step on the threshold of Dagon in Ashdod to this day. What a curious story. You see the Philistines as they try to degrade the ark. The ark is the symbol of Jehovah, God, the God of Israel, and we hate that guy. He's not as good as our God, as Dagon is. And so we put it at Dagon's feet. And as such, they put a picture of God over God himself, don't they? They take their picture, their idol that they've made, and they put it in a position of superiority to God. They declare them their own gods better. And even, I think you'll see, they declare themselves better. Because what happens when Dagon falls over? Who picks Dagon up? Who sets him in his place of power? It's not Dagon, it's the Philistines. He falls over, they put him in his position of power. They put him in his authoritative position. Because when you think about it, idols aren't real. Idols are an image that humans make to represent their own will and their own want to disobey God. It's the deity that tells them to do what they want to do. It's the deity based on their ideas, and it really all stems from them. An idol can't speak, it can't talk, it can't act. That point is made over and over in Scripture. An idol is only as good as the people behind it are. People set up the idol, people bow down to that idol, people worship themselves and declare themselves better. But it's not just the foreigners who do these things. Isn't it a shame that when you get to chapter 7 in verses 3 and 4, you see that Israel is doing exactly the same things? Israel in chapter 7 is mourning the loss of the ark of the Lord. They got the ark back in the meantime. In the end of chapter 5 and chapter 6, they got the ark back. They received it ungratefully, and so many of them were struck down, and they left the ark just kind of sitting in the countryside somewhere. But they really want it to come back. In 1 Samuel 7, verses 1 and 2, they're mourning for the house of the Lord to bring the ark back into it. And so Samuel talks to them. And Samuel says in verses 3 and 4, if you want to return to the Lord, what do? Get rid of the idols, because you've brought idols in. And now you're worshiping the Baals and the Ashtaroth, all these foreign gods. Why are you doing that? Get rid of those things if you want to serve the Lord. How are you supposed to serve the Lord? He says, serve him alone. And the sons of Israel removed the Baals and the Ashtaroth, and they served the Lord alone. Some people have issues serving God instead of serving their own traditions. Some people serve God and also serve some other stuff. Maybe you put that other stuff above God. Maybe you put that other stuff just on God's level. Great. Neither of them are good. Neither of them is holier than the other one. You remember the Egyptians. The Egyptians trusted in their gods rather than the Lord God. They put their gods over the Lord, even when it was objectively irrational to do so. The Lord caused a plague, blood in the Nile, all of the water turning to blood. And what did the Egyptians do? They had their magicians somehow turn the water into blood. It wasn't as much or as impressive as God did. They couldn't reverse what God did, but they could do a little bit of it. And so they declared their gods better, or at least just as good. The frogs came. God sent all the frogs. And what did the Egyptians do? They magicked a few frogs as well. Well, great. Now we've just added to the problem, but it proves that our gods have some power, don't they? And then the gnats came, and even the magicians said, we can't do anything with this. This God is bigger. And yet Pharaoh never turned. Pharaoh glorified his own gods instead of the Lord. Think about Balaam. Balaam the prophet. Balaam, a prophet of God who talked to God. And we see those conversations recorded. Balaam, who is summoned by Balak, a king who hates Israel and wants Balaam to curse Israel. Balaam says, I can't do anything unless God allows me to do it. So what? So I'm going to sacrifice to God in the hope that he will change his mind. And so he sacrifices on that one mountain, and God blesses Israel. He doesn't curse them. And Balaam says, hold on. If I go to a different mountain and I set up different altars and I offer another sacrifice, maybe God will change his mind. Because in Balaam's head, he has a version of God who is pliable and manipulatable, and he's able to sacrifice and press all the right buttons and get God to do what he wants. And it doesn't work the second time. And so what does he say the third time? What if I go to another mountain and I set up more altars and I offer more sacrifices? Maybe he'll listen then. Because Balaam's God, his version of God, was not God at all. His version of God was a God who would listen to him and obey his every will. Ananias and Sapphira had a version of God. Acts chapter 5, they lied, and God struck them down for it. Their version of God wasn't omnipotent, or he wasn't omniscient, or he just didn't care what his people did. I don't know what they were thinking. Maybe they thought their version of God allowed lying or allowed their pride to fester. Maybe they thought that it was good in God's eyes, and that's why they did it. I don't know. But their version of God was not the true God. And it begs the question, how often do we do exactly that same kind of thing? How often do we use our thought processes to justify actions that really aren't godly? Or we act based on our ideas and thoughts and feelings and not on the truth that's in God's word? When you're asked why you responded to a certain situation in the way that you did, is it because you have a biblical example and a reason for why you did it? Or is it just because you felt it and so God was okay with it? You have to follow God, and you have to follow God alone. God shares everything except the spotlight with you. And you see, ultimately, God comes around. He destroys everything about the false gods. And Dagon is cast down and destroyed. Ultimately, the ark is returned because God curses every single city he goes through. Nothing can stop him as he destroys the gods and those people that follow them. Don't be those people. Follow God and follow God alone. And you'll find a few people actually do. You'll find there are a few, and in those extenuating circumstances, when God removes all the other options, sometimes a few actually listen. And so in 1 Samuel chapter 7, you have a people who have lost the ark. You have a people who have lost the battles. You have a people who don't know what to do. And Samuel comes in. He says, "Put away your foreign gods. Serve the Lord alone, and he will save you from the hands of the Philistines." What does Israel do? Israel starts to do those very things that we have just spoken of. They serve the Lord. They set aside the Baals and the Ashtaroth and serve the Lord alone. Pick up reading in verse 5 and watch what unfolds as the story happens. Then Samuel said, "Gather all of Israel to Mizpah, and I will pray to the Lord for you." So they gathered to Mizpah and drew water and poured it out before the Lord and fasted on that day and said there, "We have sinned against the Lord." And Samuel judged the sons of Israel at Mizpah. Now, when the Philistines heard that the sons of Israel had gathered at Mizpah, the governors of the Philistines went up against Israel. And when the sons of Israel heard about it, they were afraid of the Philistines. Well, you see here, there's an ongoing war, right? They lost a battle, they lost two battles, but the Philistines are still against them. They're in active war, and so the Philistines see all the Israelites gathered together. Hey, we can knock them out all at one time. And so they go up for it. And Israel is afraid. They are afraid of the Philistines. Look at verse 8. So the sons of Israel said to Samuel, "Don't stop crying out to the Lord our God for us, that he will save us from the hand of the Philistines." And Samuel took a nursing lamb and offered it as a whole burnt offering to the Lord. And Samuel cried out to the Lord for Israel, and the Lord answered him. Now Samuel was offering up the burnt offering, and the Philistines approached to battle Israel, but the Lord thundered with a great thunder on that day against the Philistines and confused them so that they were struck down before Israel. And the men of Israel came out of Mizpah and pursued the Philistines and killed them as far as below Bethkar. This is a people who has learned that ritual doesn't work. This is a people who have learned that we need to put away the other gods, our other ideas, and serve the Lord alone. These are people who have taken to the Lord completely, and you see that their faith leads to God's faithfulness. As they pronounce their belief in God, As they, stick to their guns, the Philistines are advancing. They don't form a battle line. They ask Samuel to pray. They don't try to defend themselves. They know they can't, but they know that they can rely on the Lord. As they've repented, they know that their sin is removed and God protects the righteous. They're made righteous, and so they rely on the Lord. And they trust in God, getting spiritually safe and well with Him, to the result that He delays the Philistines, He casts them aside, He confuses them, and allows Israel the victory that day. They're spiritual. Their seeking of the spiritual safety leads them to even a physical safety. At the end of the day, it's not them who won the battle, it's the Lord. Follow only God, and you follow Him entirely. And yet, as we go through life as humans, it's so easy to just focus on everything else. We come to worship not because it's what is good and right, but we come to worship because it's expected. We have our usual seats, and we know that if we're not sitting there, someone will notice, and we'll get a phone call later on, and we don't want to have to explain that, and so we'll show up just because. And we obey God not because it's what we should do, but because it's what we're used to, and we would feel bad if we didn't. We're not worshiping God. We're just serving ourselves and what we're used to. A lot of people base their decisions not on God. They instead make their decisions and base their God off of those decisions. But that is not discipleship. That is not the way of learning from God. Discipleship is the practice of being God's. And that means you deny yourself. It's not about you. It's not about your thoughts, not about your wants, not about your feelings, not about your inclinations. Nobody cares. It's about doing what's right, and doing what's right as is defined by the Lord. So many times in Israel's history, you see a people who get lost in themselves, and they start doing their same old familiar practices again and again, but without the heart behind them. And you see Israel get invested in worshiping the local deities and following those pressures that are from their area, pushing down on them. And you see, even in the next chapter, this doesn't last. It doesn't last for very long at all. Israel gets infatuated with having a king just like everybody else. Don't we often seek those same kind of ideas? Just to do what we do because we do it, to cave to the local pressure because it's right there, to be just like everyone else because it's so much easier. That's not what a disciple does. Disciples follow God. They follow God only, and they follow God entirely with everything they have. We all have a choice to make on what we kind of center ourselves around. We all have a choice to make on what we found ourselves on. What drives our decision-making process? Those internal, external forces, what are they? You all have a choice on what that is. Make sure it's God. Nothing else is as steady as God is. No one else can save you like God can. No one else can help you as Jesus has and does and will continue to do. And so we ask that question: who will follow Jesus? He's looking for followers, and He's willing to take you if you're willing to obey Him. Is there anything we can do to help you? If there is, let me know. I'll be standing right here and be glad to talk to you as we stand and sing this song.